Welcome back to the Commercial Property Podcast. And today we're talking about something I've rather dramatically called the Great Commercial Property Wealth Transfer. And, this is a phenomenon that's happening in the residential world as well. And so I'm going to talk to you about how it affects commercial property in particular and what you can do today to basically source property that is coming onto the market as a result of this. So let's get going. So it's very important, obviously, when you're looking for deals to look for properties. That's a pretty obvious statement that I've just made. So we want to look for properties. We want to look at things where we can add value. We want to look at properties where that there's income producing. It depends on your objectives, obviously, as to what you're looking for. You might want to look at properties where there is solid income for a long period of time. So you'll be looking for long leases, you'll be looking for great tenants, you'll be looking for good rents, inflation-linked rent reviews, etc. Or you might be looking for value-add opportunities where there's short leases, subdivision opportunities, tenant mix changes, or whatever else it might be. But one of the biggest opportunities in property, and whether that's commercial or residential, isn't the property at all. It's actually the person that owns it. And what we're looking for when we're trying to get the very best deals is who is selling the property and why are they selling? Because if we become property problem solvers, i.e. we solve problems for vendors, we create solutions that can be acted on relatively quickly, then we're basically adding huge value to transactions. So an understanding of who the seller is, who the vendor is, why they're selling, how long they've owned the property for, can add massive value. And these are all questions that you can ask agents when you speak to them. I see such and such a property's on the market. Why is the vendor selling? How long has it been on the market for? All of this will give you an indication as to the identity of the seller and why they are selling. And right now, there's very powerful demographic and economic forces creating motivated sellers all over the country. That's why I call it the window of opportunity. And we've seen this window of opportunity for kind of the last 3 years. And I'm anticipating that this window is only going to actually get better. But let's start with the demographics. So a lot of commercial owners who are selling at the moment bought their properties maybe 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years ago. They're private investors, business owners, families, small portfolio holders, maybe even small pension funds and trusts. And they've accumulated property over decades. They've bought all types of property from shops, industrial, offices, mixed use units, long before commercial property became fashionable. And many of them have done incredibly well from the properties. They've probably, I've spoken to commercial sellers where, a property's paid for their children's school fees, it's paid for their first house, it's paid for university or whatever else. And so they've done really well out of these properties. But time does catch up with everyone. And a lot of these sellers are now approaching retirement age. You can call them baby boomers, or whatever the right name for them are. Some are retired, some are getting up to retirement. They're well into their 70s and 80s. And a lot of them have reached the point where they no longer want the responsibility of managing a property, dealing with maintenance, negotiating leases, dealing with managing agents, or worrying about legislation. And of course, every time there's a little bit of a shift in legislation or a change of government, that motivation very often becomes greater. And what I see with a lot of these properties is that, and certainly not all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but a proportion, they lost their motivation maybe 5-10 years ago. And so a lot of these properties will have tenants that are holding over under leases that haven't been renewed. They might even have vacant properties. There might be maintenance issues. Because the landlord has taken a step back and just hasn't wanted to deal with the property. They've got way past that point. They might have left it to a managing agent who's not doing a particularly good job as well. Now, of course, on one hand, those kind of properties are problems, but on the other hand, they are very much opportunities because, that there's opportunity to add value. So so that they present properties, they're selling properties where there's these kind of potentials for nice uplifts. And these retiring landlords, commercial property is not always easy to pass on. Sometimes, and very often, children don't want the assets. Sometimes there hasn't been any inheritance tax planning. And so properties kind of have to be sold as a potential pot for inheritance tax, especially if the vendors have already passed away. Children might live elsewhere, have different careers, have no interest in becoming property investors, and have no understanding of commercial property at all. That's a bit of a cautionary tale, isn't it, for those of us who have portfolios and want to pass them on. And obviously, this creates a challenge for the owner, because what happens when they want cash? The next generation wants cash, but not building. So obviously, that they then at that point potentially want to sell. And this is where the opportunities start to emerge. So, I speak to vendors who are looking to retire and sell them, but I also speak to families of deceased vendors who, they just want to offload the properties. They're not interested in them at all. They might even have inheritance tax liabilities to pay as part of that. So, the opportunities arise because, this desire, this motivation to sell. And the second factor could be, and not always, refinancing pressure. So for many years, commercial property owners, as many other owners of property, benefited from exceptionally low interest rates. And so debt was cheap, refinancing was straightforward, loan to values were good, property values were rising, life was pretty easy. But then obviously what happened was bond yields rose, interest rates rose, values adjusted, and lenders have become more cautious. Now, it's still very, very possible and very achievable to get lending, but it's just more expensive. And there's a lot of these sellers, a big proportion might owe them cash, but the proportion that do need them do need to have finance, might be coming to the end of their finance cycles, and the numbers just don't work as comfortably as they once did. Debt is higher. They might find that because they haven't managed the properties particularly well, they're not able to max out on values because there's, empty units or leases holding over. And it might be that actually the properties aren't particularly lettable because they've not been managed well, or there might be some maintenance issues that are needed as well. All of this is going to hit the valuation and the sales prices. And the finance is creating a reason why they may want to sell rather than refinance. For a 75-year-old landlord, the prospect of one more refinancing cycle may just be the final straw and may, be the last thing that they want to do in their retirement. So selling becomes the easiest option. And then obviously if you kind of layer on top regulation, there's EPC regulation, the MEES requirements, health and safety, fire regs, compliance obligations, tax obligations, environmental concerns, and more recently the upward only rent reviews, being banned, and that legislation is still emerging, but we know there's definitely going to be a ban on upward only rent reviews, and this all creates additional work. And for younger investors, for professional investors as well, it's just part of the job. It's just what you do. They're manageable challenges. But for aging landlords, they can definitely become reasons to exit. And so when you start viewing commercial property through that lens, through, kind of identifying sellers, then everything changes. And if you stop looking for buildings and look for circumstances, you look for sellers, you look for motivation, then you can actually find some really motivated sellers who want to sell quickly in the market. Does this mean that every aging landlord's a motivated seller? Of course not, far from it. Some children actually want to take on property portfolios. They're working in businesses. I know a lot of kind of aging property investors who still are absolutely, keen to manage their portfolios. So but it does mean that the potential opportunities are growing, and I think that that'll continue to grow over the next decade. And the importance of having a niche, I talk a lot about niching, but the importance of having a niche is if you understand your niche, your investing location, the sector, you understand your value add strategies, and we've talked about that. I've talked about that loads on this podcast, on other episodes. Then the investors who understand their markets deeply will be the ones best positioned to benefit. They'll know the local industrial estates. They probably even know the owners, may even have networked with them. They'll know the landlords nearing retirement. They'll know which business owners are looking for succession plans. And we'll be having conversations long before they come to the market. So that's one of the benefits of investing relatively close to home and having a niche and having relationships in that market. So I find that the very best use of my time is sometimes networking with local business owners, local property owners. It may be that there's not immediate opportunities, but when there is, you're the person that comes to mind that they're thinking about. As I say, this isn't about taking advantage of people's problems. It's about creating win-wins. It's about creating solutions, solving problems. And the best commercial property investors are problem solvers at the end of the day. They're helping owners achieve certainty. They provide solutions, create win-win outcomes. And, when you do that, the opportunities follow. So what can you do practically about this? So first of all, you start paying attention to ownership. So when you're calling an agent about a property, who owns it? How did you get to the price? Why is the vendor selling? Now, here's the thing. If you say, how did you get to the price? And if it's a retiring landlord, don't be surprised to hear the agent say that, oh, that's what the vendor wants. There's no science behind it. The seller's saying, I've owned this for 30 years. It's done me proud. It's a great property, possibly the greatest commercial property in this town. You got to get the drift. And, I wouldn't accept anything less than this price for it. Now, of course, that could be totally realistic. And in my experience, very often it is very unrealistic. But that's just a motivation thing. They're not motivated enough at that particular point in time. So this is where follow-up becomes your friend. If you understand why the vendor's selling, and this is your question to the agent is, who's a seller? Why are they selling? How long have they owned it for? How do they get to the price? All those kind of questions. So you notice we're not really asking anything about the property at this point. We're asking about the seller. If you do viewings, do your numbers and you can't get to the price, either put an offer out or just follow up on it until the vendor becomes more realistic. And I think that the market is going to be such in the next kind of 12 months where I think vendors are going to get more motivated. I think that there's more and more bad news coming out of the press. And of course, sentiment runs markets. So motivation comes from thinking, well, actually, I don't think I'm going to be able to get this price. I'll probably settle for something lower. And, if you're the only one that follows up, and believe me, you probably will be the only one that follows up because very few property investors do this stuff. If you're the only one that follows up with the agent, then, you may well be able to get that property 6-12 months down the line. Here's the other thing is if, try and do a viewing and meet the vendor. Very often, this has been their bread and butter. They know the property inside out. They know every nook and cranny. And very often I realise that agents aren't actually doing the viewings, but the sellers are. And again, that's a fantastic opportunity to meet the seller, build rapport, understand what they're after. You don't want to be offending them with, this is worth nothing like this. That's not what this game's about. It's about building that rapport. And, if you say something very, casually, like, I've been trying to sharpen my pencil, but I just can't get to the price. Is it worth me just following up with you to see how you're getting on? You're not offending them. You're not kind of affecting that relationship. So build relationships, speak to agents, accountants, surveyors, solicitors, business owners, property owners, and understand their succession plans as well. Build those relationships because the best opportunities are often identified years before the transaction starts, and the relationship comes first and the deal comes later. And you can also target these owners through direct to vendor. marketing. So lots of my clients have been really successful with this. I've done lots of direct to vendor campaigns as well. Again, you need to know your niche so that you can target your letter campaign. You need to understand who the kind of sellers are that you want to buy from. So, for example, you could identify through using prop tech like CoStar, Searchland, Nimbus. You could identify sellers who maybe have owned the property for 5 years or 10 years, 20 years. And obviously you're going to have to cross reference land registry and maybe even company's house to do that. But it's worth that piece of work. By the way, don't do that yourself. Make sure you've got a VA that's doing that work. And so I personally think we're at the very, very start of this particular trend. And I also think that whilst buyers know that the market has moved in the last 3 years, kind of vendors haven't got the memo. So we're just waiting for vendors a lot of the time to become more motivated. And again, sentiment may move, bad news, headlines may start to move some vendors in that direction. So it's really important that early on to realize the difference between kind of chasing properties and chasing vendors. Obviously, ultimately, what you want to buy is the property, but understanding motivation is so important to create a win-win. And, ticking the boxes of what these vendors are looking for, are they going to have big corporation tax bills? Is there going to be capital gains tax implications? If it's a multi-let property, could you buy it over a period of years? There's so many different ways you can structure deals. But the first question you need to be asking these vendors is, what's the ideal outcome for you? Kind of, what are you looking for? Do you have any tax obligations? Do you have any debt or whatever it might be? So sometimes the most valuable thing to understand isn't actually the building, it's who owns it. And I can't stress enough how big this opportunity is now in the market and is going to be for the foreseeable future, at least over the next 3 to 5 years. So my recommendation to you would be to start building those relationships now. Go to your local business networking. I'm not necessarily saying property networking. Go to your local business networks. Go to your local property networks as well. But build those relationships with vendors. Build the relationships with agents who ultimately vendors will sell through. And, by all means, kind of go out and do some direct to vendor campaigns as well. So, what we're looking for is an ethical win-win, helping sellers achieve their goals whilst getting properties for a price where we can add value and ultimately get as much money out of deals as possible. So look out for those vendor opportunities, and in later episodes I'll kind of obviously talk about kind of where this market is moving to. But in the meantime, thank you for listening today, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Commercial Property Podcast.